On the night of May 10, 2002, inside the walls of Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, a 54-year-old woman took her final breath. Her name was Lynda Lyon Block, and in that cold, dimly lit execution chamber, she became the last woman ever executed in the state of Alabama. But what brought her here wasn't just murder, it was a twisted story of rebellion, delusion, and defiance. Unlike most people facing death row, Lynda never showed remorse. She never begged for mercy. In fact, she rejected the government's authority entirely. She believed the US had no legal right to execute her, or even to arrest her in the first place. This wasn't just a simple case of crime and punishment. It was a story born from chaos, where a woman and her lover went to war with the law itself. A story that began with a domestic dispute and ended with a police officer shot dead in a parking lot, his life taken by a woman who believed she was above every law written. For years, Lynda fought the system from her prison cell, writing letters, refusing lawyers, and clinging to her radical beliefs. Even on the night of her execution, she walked in calm, emotionless, and eerily proud. Some say she died as a martyr for her cause. Others say she was just another cold-blooded killer hiding behind her madness. Either way, her story remains one of the most disturbing and unusual executions in US history. A chilling mix of crime, ideology, and defiance that still raises questions today. So before we go deeper into this dark tale, how a mother, a fugitive, and a self-declared revolutionary ended up facing the electric chair. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because we have many more real stories that uncover the darkest corners of the human mind. Now, let's dive into the story of Lynda Lyon Block, the woman who went to her death believing the government had no power over her. From the outside, her childhood might have seemed ordinary, the kind filled with sunshine, small-town schools, and suburban homes. But behind closed doors, Lynda's life was shaped by trauma, instability, and emotional wounds that never fully healed. When she was just 10 years old, tragedy struck. Her father, the one person she reportedly felt closest to, died suddenly of heart failure. The event shattered the fragile balance of her young world. Losing a parent at that age is devastating for any child, but for Lynda, it marked the beginning of a lifelong spiral into anger and mistrust. She would later describe that loss as the point where everything changed forever. After her father's death, Lynda's relationship with her mother deteriorated quickly. She often spoke of being physically and mentally abused, describing her mother as controlling, cruel, and emotionally distant. Whether those claims were entirely true or partially shaped by Lynda's later paranoia is unclear, but what's certain is that her home was far from peaceful. The only person who seemed to understand her was her younger sister, Denise, born in 1952. Denise became her emotional anchor, the one person Lynda could confide in, the one who saw her softer side. They leaned on each other through the chaos, forming a bond that would last for years, even as Lynda's life grew more chaotic and unpredictable. As she entered her teenage years, Lynda was described as intelligent and strong-willed, but also restless. She was the kind of girl who questioned everything, distrusted authority, and refused to be told what to do. That rebellious streak would later evolve into something much darker, a deep resentment toward any form of control. By adulthood, Lynda's search for stability seemed endless. She moved through relationships, jobs, and new identities as if she were trying to fill a hole left by her father's death and her mother's abuse. Then, later in life, she did something that shocked everyone who knew her. She married an 80-year-old man named Carl. Carl was far older than her, old enough to be her grandfather, and their relationship raised eyebrows. Some saw it as Lynda finally finding a father figure she had longed for. Others believed it was something else entirely, a calculated move, perhaps rooted in a need for control, security, or validation. At first, Carl gave her the kind of stability she had never known. He was calm, wealthy, and dependable, the opposite of the chaos she had grown up with. But as with everything in Lynda's life, that peace didn't last. Over time, their relationship soured. Lynda became increasingly controlling and distrustful, often accusing Carl of betrayal and manipulation. The marriage collapsed in 1991, ending in divorce that left her bitter and angry at the world. By then, something inside her had shifted. The young girl from Orlando who once dreamed of a normal life had been replaced by a woman consumed by resentment. She saw every disagreement as persecution, every authority as an enemy. It's here that we start to see the early signs of the mindset that would one day define her, the belief that she was not bound by the laws or systems of any government. To her, the world had wronged her too many times: her father's death, her mother's abuse, her failed marriage. Everything reinforced one core belief: the system cannot be trusted. In later years, people who met Lynda would describe her as intelligent but unhinged. She was articulate and persuasive, the kind of woman who could talk circles around anyone who challenged her. Yet behind her calm tone and confident words, there was a brewing storm. Her divorce from Carl didn't just end a marriage, it marked the beginning of her descent into isolation and radical thought. She started immersing herself in anti-government literature, exploring fringe ideologies and connecting with others who shared her distrust of authority. The woman who once longed for love and belonging was now seeking power. Not emotional power, but the kind that comes from rejecting every rule society lives by. And by the time the 1990s rolled in, that mindset had hardened. She no longer saw police officers, judges, or politicians as protectors of justice. She saw them as enemies, enemies of freedom, enemies of truth, enemies of her. The seeds of what would one day lead to bloodshed were already planted. But at that point, no one could have imagined that this same woman, a once bright girl from Orlando who lost her father too soon, would end up taking the life of a police officer and going to her death still convinced that she had done nothing wrong. Lynda Lyon Block's story didn't begin with murder. It began with loss, control, and defiance. But in the chapters ahead, those same traits would twist into something far more dangerous. After her divorce in 1991, Lynda Lyon Block moved south to Key West, Florida, in search of a fresh start. For a time, it seemed like she had finally found her place. She threw herself into community work, becoming a respected figure in the small island town. Lynda wasn't just another resident. She was everywhere. She served as secretary for the local Humane Society, investigating reports of animal abuse and helping organize adoption drives. She even became president of the Friends of the Library, where she helped raise funds and coordinate public events. To most people, she was a passionate, civic-minded woman, the kind of person who genuinely wanted to make her town better. Neighbors remembered her as articulate, confident, and persuasive. She spoke about justice, fairness, and compassion, qualities that made her a natural leader in community projects. But behind that charisma, something else was taking shape, a growing sense of disillusionment with the very systems she once supported. Her political involvement gave her a front-row seat to the messiness of power. She volunteered in local political campaigns, often working closely with candidates and local officials. But the more she saw, the more she began to question it all. She started noticing what she believed were hypocrisies, laws that protected the powerful but punished the weak, politicians who promised reform but only served themselves. For someone like Lynda, intelligent, idealistic, and deeply skeptical, this became the spark for something much bigger. Around this time, she launched her own political magazine called Liberatus, Latin for to set free. The magazine focused on government corruption, freedom, and civil rights. At first, it was simply a platform for discussion, a way to challenge the status quo and give ordinary citizens a voice. But over time, her writings took a sharper tone. In its early issues, Liberatus included thoughtful essays about animal welfare, local politics, and the moral duty of citizens. Yet, as months passed, the tone shifted. Lynda began writing about government overreach, taxation, and the erosion of personal freedoms. She wrote as if she were waging an intellectual war, not against any single politician, but against the entire structure of government itself. Her skepticism deepened into anger. She started quoting anti-government thinkers and referencing constitutional loopholes to argue that the US government had strayed from its founding principles. Friends who once admired her community work began to feel uneasy around her. They said she had changed, that she no longer spoke about helping others, but about resisting authority. One former colleague recalled, "She stopped trusting anyone who worked for the government. It didn't matter if you were a cop, a clerk, or a city official. She believed you were part of a corrupt system." The transformation was slow, but undeniable. The woman who once fought to protect animals and promote civic engagement was now turning her back on the very institutions she used to serve. The same passion that made her a respected activist was now fueling her distrust of the state. By the early 1990s, Lynda Lyon Block had crossed an invisible line, from protector to dissenter. Her writings grew more extreme, her conversations more paranoid. She began referring to herself not as a citizen, but as a sovereign individual, beholden to no government authority. To the casual observer, she still appeared intelligent and articulate, but those who knew her best could sense a growing bitterness. Her ideas were no longer just political opinions. They had become a belief system, a personal religion of resistance, and soon that belief would lead her straight into the path of another anti-government activist, a man who would share her vision, her rage, and eventually her fate. Next came George Sibley, the man who would turn Lynda Lyon Block's ideology into action and her defiance into tragedy. By the summer of 1992, the woman once known for rescuing animals and editing political essays had become consumed by anger and obsession. Lynda Lyon Block no longer trusted anyone. Not the government, not the police, not even the people closest to her. Her failed marriage to Carl Block, the elderly man she had once called her source of stability, had ended in bitterness. But even after their divorce in 1991, their connection hadn't truly died. The separation left lingering conflicts, especially over money and property. And for Lynda, those disputes weren't just legal battles. They were personal wars against betrayal. In her mind, Carl had joined the long list of people who had wronged her. She became convinced that he had no right to claim property they once shared, and when she felt unheard by the courts, the woman who once believed in justice decided to take it into her own hands. On a quiet day in August 1992, Carl Block was at his Orlando apartment, unaware that Lynda had been watching, waiting, and planning. What began as a domestic dispute soon spiraled into something far more sinister. Lynda broke into Carl's home, not with the intent to talk, but to teach him a lesson. Reports say she tied him up, gagged him, and demanded that he renounce any claim to their shared property. Carl, frightened and confused, refused. That refusal sparked something dark inside her. According to court documents during the confrontation, Lynda stabbed Carl in the chest. It was a shocking escalation, the moment her ideological anger became physical violence. The act didn't kill him immediately, but it was enough to leave deep physical and emotional scars. This was no longer about freedom or sovereignty. It was about domination, about proving she couldn't be controlled, even by those who had once loved her. After the attack, Lynda fled, refusing to face the consequences. She didn't see herself as a criminal. In her mind, the system had failed her, and any attempt to arrest or charge her was further proof that the government was corrupt. This was the moment her transformation was complete, from dissenter to fugitive. While on the run, she crossed paths with George E. Sibley Jr., a man whose beliefs mirrored her own. Like Lynda, George was intelligent, articulate, and fiercely anti-government. He too believed the justice system was a lie designed to enslave the people. To outsiders, their relationship seemed like a union of love. But in reality, it was more like a meeting of two storm fronts, a collision of paranoia, rage, and rebellion. Together they built a world of their own, a private ideology that justified anything they did in the name of freedom. Friends who once knew Lynda said she had grown colder, sharper. She no longer spoke like an activist or a citizen. She spoke like a revolutionary. Every word dripped with contempt for authority. With George by her side, that contempt grew into defiance. The pair began traveling under false names, living out of motels and cheap rentals. They isolated themselves from society, convinced they were being watched. Every police siren, every unfamiliar face became a sign of government surveillance. But their life on the run only deepened their bond. George and Lynda weren't just partners in love, they were partners in rebellion. Together they saw themselves as outlaws standing against a corrupt nation. By this point, Lynda's old life was gone completely. The woman who once volunteered for the Humane Society now carried weapons. The editor of Liberatus had turned her pen into a sword, her words into action. In her mind, she hadn't crossed the line. She had simply stopped pretending it existed. Yet the consequences of that August night in Orlando would follow her wherever she went. A warrant was issued for her arrest. She was now officially a fugitive from justice, wanted for assault and armed violence. But Lynda wasn't ready to surrender. Not to the law, not to reason, and not to her own conscience. And with George Sibley at her side, her rebellion was about to reach its violent climax. The next chapter in her story would not take place in Florida, but in Alabama, where her defiance against authority would end in blood, tragedy, and a death sentence that would make her name echo through history. By October 4, 1992, Lynda Lyon Block and George E. Sibley Jr. were no longer activists or fugitives. They were drifters. Their anti-government beliefs had cut them off from society, and they lived out of their car, surviving from one parking lot to another. Their home was now a 1984 blue Oldsmobile, parked in the Walmart parking lot in Opelika, Alabama. Inside that cramped car sat a man, a woman, and a 9-year-old boy, Lynda's son from a previous relationship. It was a makeshift shelter for a family on the run, trying to stay invisible while the law searched for them across state lines. To most people, it was just another car in a crowded parking lot. But that afternoon, someone noticed something strange. A child sitting in the back seat of a worn-down car, looking unwashed and anxious. The person grew concerned. Why was a young boy living in a parking lot? Was he okay? Out of compassion and worry, the passerby called the police to check on the child's welfare. That single phone call would set off a chain of events that changed everything. When Sergeant Roger Motley Jr. arrived, he wasn't expecting danger. Motley, a 43-year-old officer with years of experience, was known for his calm approach and sense of duty. He was the kind of cop who treated people with patience, especially when children were involved. Motley parked his patrol car near the Oldsmobile, unaware that the man inside saw him not as help, but as an enemy of freedom. When he approached the vehicle, George Sibley stepped out, tense and defensive. Motley explained why he was there. A concerned citizen had called about the boy, and he needed to make sure everything was okay. It was a simple welfare check, routine and harmless. But to Sibley it was an act of government intrusion. When Motley asked for identification, Sibley refused. "I don't have to show you anything," he said. "You have no jurisdiction over me." That phrase, "no jurisdiction," was a cornerstone of Lynda and George's belief system. They considered themselves sovereign citizens, not bound by US law. So when Motley insisted again, Sibley's anger boiled over. The exchange grew heated, voices rising in the afternoon air. Witnesses later recalled seeing the two men arguing near the cars, but no one knew just how close the situation was to erupting. Then, gunfire. Shots cracked through the parking lot, sending bystanders ducking for cover. Sergeant Motley and George Sibley exchanged bullets in a sudden violent burst. Motley managed to fire and wound Sibley, hitting him in the side. But Sibley fired back, and chaos followed. Inside the Oldsmobile, Lynda Lyon Block saw everything. Her partner was bleeding, the man she loved shot by someone she viewed as part of the corrupt system she had spent years fighting. And in that moment, she made a choice that sealed both their fates. Lynda stepped out of the car, raised her weapon and opened fire. The scene descended into madness. Gunshots echoed across the parking lot as customers screamed and ran for cover. Some witnesses recalled seeing Lynda crouched beside the car, firing toward the fallen officer. Others said she stood tall, shouting as she shot. What's certain is that Sergeant Motley was struck multiple times. Some reports claim it was impossible to determine whose bullet was fatal, but what mattered was the result. Motley lay mortally wounded on the asphalt, bleeding beneath the pale afternoon sky. In a cruel twist of fate, Motley had given his bulletproof vest to another officer earlier that day. Without it, he was left unprotected, one simple act of generosity that cost him his life. As the echoes of gunfire faded, Lynda and Sibley realized what they had done. The officer was down. The police would come. They grabbed the boy and fled. The car roared to life, speeding out of the Walmart parking lot as horrified shoppers dialed 911. Behind them, Sergeant Roger Motley lay dying, a devoted officer, a father, a husband. His final moments spent trying to check on the safety of a child. The man and woman who believed they were above the law had now crossed the ultimate line. They drove off into the Alabama countryside, leaving behind a trail of panic, smoke, and shattered lives. But even in flight, Lynda and George didn't see themselves as killers. To them, this wasn't murder. It was self-defense against tyranny. In their minds, Motley represented the government they believed had no right to exist. Later that evening, Motley was pronounced dead, his death sending shockwaves through the Opelika community. He had served with honor, and his kindness toward citizens, even in tense situations, was well known. The loss was devastating. For Lynda and Sibley, the manhunt began almost immediately. Law enforcement from multiple states joined the search. The fugitives were armed, dangerous, and willing to kill. As they ran, they stuck to their beliefs. They refused to recognize arrest warrants, court orders, or even the right of the state to prosecute them. They called themselves sovereign, but all that sovereignty did was lead them deeper into violence and delusion. In the coming days, they would be caught, tried, and condemned. But on that October afternoon in Opelika, everything changed. What began as a simple welfare check, a concerned call about a little boy in a car, ended in a brutal, senseless death. One man died doing his job. One woman solidified her path toward execution. The parking lot at Walmart became the line between ideology and bloodshed, the moment when Lynda Lyon Block's fight against authority became her final undoing. After the tragic Walmart shooting that left Sergeant Roger Lamar Motley Jr. dead, Lynda Lyon Block and her partner George E. Sibley Jr. were captured following a brief but intense manhunt. The nation watched in disbelief as the story unfolded, not just because of the crime itself, but because of what came after. What began as a violent confrontation turned into a courtroom spectacle where Lynda challenged not just her charges, but the very legitimacy of the American justice system. Lynda was charged with capital murder under Alabama Code, paragraph 13A 540A 5, the section defining the killing of a police officer on duty as a capital offense. For the prosecution, this was straightforward. A police officer had been shot and killed in the line of duty, and 2 people were responsible. But for Lynda, it became something far more. A stage to express her deep mistrust of government, her anti-establishment beliefs, and her determination to stand by them even in the face of death. From the very start, she refused to cooperate with her court-appointed attorneys. She insisted on representing herself pro se, claiming that no lawyer within the system could represent her interests because the system itself was corrupt. Her decision alarmed both the court and observers, especially given the gravity of a capital case. Still, she was adamant. She saw lawyers as officers of the court, agents of the same government she believed had no authority over her. During pre-trial hearings, Lynda repeatedly interrupted proceedings with long speeches about constitutional law, sovereignty, and jurisdiction. She declared that Alabama had no legal right to try her, arguing that the state had never been properly readmitted to the Union after the Civil War. Therefore, in her view, its courts had no lawful standing. She also claimed she was not subject to U.S. laws because she had never entered into a contract with the government, a familiar stance among sovereign citizen movements. Her filings were filled with dense, pseudo-legal rhetoric, rejecting driver's licenses, birth certificates, and all forms of government identification. She introduced herself as a free and sovereign being, not a citizen of the United States. To the judge and jury, it seemed delusional. To her, it was absolute truth. Despite the court's efforts to ensure she understood the consequences of representing herself, Lynda stood firm. The Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals later reviewed this decision in Block v. State, 1997, remanding the case temporarily to verify that her waiver of counsel was both knowing and voluntary. It was. Lynda knew what she was doing, and she wanted the world to see her doing it. Throughout the trial, her confrontational style made proceedings chaotic. She often refused to address the judge properly, dismissed questions as irrelevant under natural law, and sometimes refused to participate altogether. When witnesses took the stand, she rarely cross-examined them. Instead, she used her time to deliver passionate tirades about freedom, justice, and tyranny. Meanwhile, the prosecution presented a clear and compelling case. Sergeant Motley had responded to a welfare call concerning a child alone in a car. When he approached, George Sibley refused to provide identification. The situation escalated, shots were fired, and Motley died. The evidence, eyewitness accounts, and ballistics all pointed to both Lynda and Sibley's involvement. Whether or not it could be proven whose bullet had caused the fatal wound, Alabama law allowed both participants in the confrontation to be held equally responsible for the officer's death. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the trial progressed. Lynda's outbursts frustrated the judge, who at one point threatened to remove her from the courtroom. But she thrived on defiance, feeding on the attention as though the entire system she despised had finally been forced to listen to her voice. In closing arguments, she did not plead for mercy. Instead, she spoke about liberty, sovereignty, and divine justice. She said she was answerable only to God, not the court, and that she would not beg for her life from an unlawful government. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding her guilty of capital murder. In the penalty phase, she refused to present mitigating evidence or allow anyone to speak on her behalf. When the sentence of death was announced, she showed no visible reaction. George Sibley received the same fate in a separate trial. Over the following years, Lynda filed numerous appeals, each echoing the same arguments: that Alabama lacked jurisdiction, that the government had violated her rights as a sovereign citizen, that her conviction was void under natural law. Every court rejected her claims. By the late 1990s, her appeals were exhausted. Still, Lynda remained defiant behind bars. In letters and interviews, she insisted she was not a murderer, but a patriot standing against an oppressive regime. Her writings revealed a woman who saw herself not as a criminal, but as a martyr, someone willing to die for her beliefs, no matter how misguided they seemed to others. When asked if she feared death, she reportedly smiled and said, "They can kill my body, but not my truth." In many ways, Lynda's trial was less about guilt or innocence and more about rebellion. She had spent her life fighting authority, and in the end she brought that fight into the courtroom, transforming a legal proceeding into a symbolic battle she was destined to lose. As her execution date drew near, one thing became clear. Lynda Lyon Block had chosen her path long before that day in Opelika, and no law, no judge, and no prison could ever make her renounce it. When the courtroom doors closed and the sentence was sealed, Lynda Lyon Block entered a new world, one defined by steel bars, silence, and time. On December 21, 1994, she was officially assigned institutional number Z575 and transferred to the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama, the same facility where every woman sentenced to death in the state awaited her fate. Life on death row was stark and isolating. Lynda's cell was small, lit by a dull fluorescent bulb, with a narrow bed and a metal toilet bolted to the wall. Contact with other inmates was limited to short conversations through bars or brief interactions in the yard. For many prisoners, the isolation broke them, but for Lynda, it became a kind of fortress, a place where she could nurture her beliefs without interference. She refused to conform to the routines of submission that defined prison life. While some inmates sought solace in religion, Lynda already had her own gospel, her unwavering distrust of government, and her conviction that she was a sovereign woman wrongfully imprisoned by an illegitimate system. Even behind bars, she continued to write letters filled with legal arguments and political declarations. Her tone was unyielding, often quoting sections of the Constitution or referencing obscure legal doctrines to justify her stance. Lynda never recanted her beliefs. Prison officials noted that she carried herself with pride, refusing to show remorse or vulnerability. Guards described her as polite but detached, a woman who obeyed rules only when they aligned with her own moral code. While other inmates bonded over shared pain or fear, Lynda kept her distance, maintaining an air of superiority. She saw herself not as a criminal among criminals, but as a political prisoner, the victim of a corrupt state she had long denounced. Her correspondence, where available through archival sources, reflected both defiance and exhaustion. She often wrote about spiritual sovereignty, claiming that her confinement was physical but not moral. To her, death row was not punishment, but proof that the government feared her truth. Yet, beneath the surface of her ideological armor, traces of loneliness appeared. The endless days, the sterile walls, and the absence of meaningful contact took their toll. While she never publicly admitted despair, her tone sometimes shifted in later letters, less fiery, more reflective. She wondered whether anyone outside truly understood her fight, or if her words were lost in a world that had already judged her. Lynda's opportunities for appeal dwindled with each passing year. Still, she continued to file motions and petitions, repeating the same constitutional arguments that had been rejected time and again. Even as her execution date neared, she refused to seek clemency. To do so would mean recognizing the authority of a government she had denied all her life. For nearly 8 years she lived this way, isolated, unbending, and convinced she was right. In the stillness of Tutwiler Prison, surrounded by walls meant to silence her, Lynda Lyon Block never surrendered her voice. As her appeals were exhausted and no court would entertain her sovereign claims, the state of Alabama scheduled the execution of Lynda Lyon Block. After nearly 8 years on death row, her defiance would end, not through surrender, but through voltage. The date was set, May 10th, 2002. A few days before her execution, Lynda was moved from Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women to the Holman Correctional Facility near Atmore, the site of Alabama's death chamber. Holman was infamous among inmates. Its most notorious resident was the electric chair itself, nicknamed Yellow Mama. The name came from its distinctive yellow paint, applied decades earlier with highway line paint. The device had claimed dozens of lives, its wooden frame and leather straps holding the condemned in place as the state delivered its ultimate punishment. For Lynda, this was not a moment of panic. Prison staff later reported that she remained calm and silent during the transfer, her posture straight, her gaze fixed. The same defiance that had carried her through the courtroom now defined her final days. In the hours leading up to her execution, she was granted the opportunity to see a few close visitors. Among them were 3 longtime friends and a spiritual advisor. They described her as stoic, even serene. One friend recalled that Lynda spoke about truth and freedom, maintaining that she was not afraid of dying. She insisted that death would only prove her innocence in the eyes of God. She was offered a last meal as was customary. Lynda refused it. She declined any food, choosing instead to fast. When asked if she wanted to make a final statement, she refused that as well. Her silence, in its own way, became her statement. One last act of control over a system she had never accepted. Just after midnight, Lynda was escorted into the small, dimly lit execution chamber. Witnesses, a mix of journalists, officials, and observers, sat behind a glass window as she was seated in Yellow Mama. Her wrists and ankles were strapped tightly to the chair's frame, her head secured with a leather harness. Electrodes were attached, one to her leg, another to a metal cap placed on her shaven scalp. A saline-soaked sponge was positioned beneath the cap to help conduct the electricity. At 12:01 a.m., the executioner flipped the switch. A surge of 2,050 volts tore through her body for 20 seconds. Her muscles seized violently. Witnesses later described the smell of burning fabric and flesh and the sight of steam rising from the sponge on her head. Then, the current dropped to 250 volts for an additional 100 seconds. The tension in her body slowly eased as the electricity continued to hum. At 12:10 a.m., Lynda Lyon Block was pronounced dead. She had shown no emotion from the moment she entered the chamber. No tears, no trembling. Her eyes remained open, her face expressionless. Commissioner Mike Haley, who was present, later remarked that she never showed emotion. Her stare was blank. For those who had followed her story, it was a fitting end to a woman who had spent her life refusing to yield to authority. Her execution marked a historic moment. Lynda was the first woman executed in Alabama since 1957, when Rhonda Bell Martin had met the same fate, also in Yellow Mama. More than 4 decades had passed between the two, but the grim symbol of state power remained unchanged. Lynda also became the last person executed in Alabama without being given a choice of method. Beginning July 1, 2002, state law allowed condemned inmates to choose between lethal injection and electrocution. For Lynda, that option came just weeks too late. Reporters outside Holman described the night as eerily quiet. There were no large protests, no vigils. Only a handful of activists and journalists gathered under the flickering lights near the prison gate. Some carried signs reading, "Stop State Killing." Others held photographs of Sergeant Roger Motley Jr., the slain officer whose death had led to this moment. Inside the prison, Lynda's body was removed from the chair, the marks of the straps still visible on her skin. She was taken to the state morgue, and her remains later released to her family. Her death did not end the debate surrounding her case, whether she was a dangerous extremist or a woman lost to paranoia and ideology. But one fact was undeniable. She had lived and died by her own beliefs. In the aftermath, newspapers across the country revisited her story. Some painted her as a domestic terrorist, others as a tragic figure consumed by delusion. Amnesty International criticized the execution as an outdated and cruel method of punishment. Supporters of the death penalty saw it as justice served for a fallen officer. For those who had known her personally, Lynda's final hours were not surprising. She had always said she would never beg the state for mercy, and she didn't. Her silence in those last moments was perhaps her truest expression of rebellion. When the switch was thrown and the current surged through Yellow Mama one final time for her, it didn't just end a life. It closed a chapter in Alabama's long and brutal history of capital punishment. At 12:10 a.m., May 10, 2002, the electricity stopped, and with it, the voice of Lynda Lyon Block. The story of Lynda Lyon Block. The story of Lynda Lyon Block did not end with her death in the electric chair. In many ways, it extended beyond that, through the fates of those connected to her, through the legacy of Yellow Mama, and through the continued debate her case reignited about justice, ideology, and the human cost of defiance. Just over 3 years after Lynda's execution, George E. Sibley Jr., her partner in both life and crime, faced his own final reckoning. On August 4, 2005, he was executed by lethal injection at Holman Correctional Facility, the same prison where Lynda had died. Unlike her, Sibley had the option to choose his method of death. By that time, Alabama law allowed condemned inmates to select between electrocution or lethal injection, a change that came into effect on July 1, 2002, mere weeks after Lynda's execution. Sibley chose the injection, perhaps preferring the quieter, clinical end over the violent spectacle of electricity. Reports from witnesses said he remained calm, refusing to make a final statement, echoing Lynda's stoic silence 3 years earlier. He was pronounced dead at 6:07 p.m., bringing closure to the state's long pursuit of justice for the murder of Sergeant Roger Motley Jr. While Sibley's execution marked the end of the case, Yellow Mama, the electric chair that killed Lynda, became a symbol, both of Alabama's hardline justice system and of an era fading into history. Built in 1927 by an inmate at Holman, the chair was constructed from oak and coated in bright yellow highway paint, giving it its chilling nickname. For decades, it served as the state's primary instrument of execution. More than 180 people were put to death in it, their final moments witnessed by small groups of officials, clergy, and reporters. After Alabama adopted lethal injection as its default method, Yellow Mama was retired. Today, the chair is still kept at Holman, stored in a space above the execution chamber, a relic of a time when death came not through a syringe, but through thousands of volts of electricity. To some, it remains a symbol of justice, to others, an artifact of cruelty. Lynda's case helped renew national debate over electrocution versus lethal injection. By the early 2000s, many states were shifting away from the electric chair, viewing it as outdated and inhumane. Witnesses described the gruesome scenes: the smell of burning flesh, the steam rising from the condemned's body, the occasional flames when equipment malfunctioned. While lethal injection was marketed as more humane, critics argued that it only sanitized the same act, taking a human life. Still, Alabama's decision to move away from the chair came too late for Lynda. Her execution, the first of a woman in the state since 1957, stood as both a milestone and a grim reminder of how the justice system evolves slowly, sometimes just beyond the reach of those it affects. Beyond the debate about methods, her story also highlighted the darker undercurrents of the sovereign citizen movement, a loosely organized ideology that rejects government authority. Lynda's courtroom defiance, her bizarre legal arguments, and her belief that the state had no jurisdiction reflected an extremist worldview that has only grown more visible in the years since. Her case became a reference point for scholars and law enforcement studying anti-government extremism. They noted how her beliefs followed a pattern: distrust of taxes, refusal to recognize laws, and the conviction that individual sovereignty overrides the state. In the courtroom, such ideology could not stand against the structured machinery of justice. Lynda's death became a cautionary tale, the moment where radical conviction collided with legal reality. For Sergeant Roger Motley's family, however, her death was not about ideology. It was about loss. Motley was a dedicated officer, remembered by his colleagues as calm, compassionate, and committed to his duty. He left behind a wife and 2 children. His name was added to local and national law enforcement memorials, ensuring that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. Every year in Opelika, Alabama, officers still mention his name during memorial services, honoring those killed in the line of duty. For them, his story is not just about one tragic day in a Walmart parking lot. It's a symbol of how quickly routine duty can turn deadly. Then there was Lynda's son, the 9-year-old boy who had been in the car that day, forced to witness the chaos that would shape his life forever. Accounts suggest that he was placed in state custody following his mother's arrest. His name has since faded from public record, perhaps intentionally, to protect his privacy. But the tragedy of his childhood lingers as a silent footnote, a reminder that justice, even when served, often leaves behind broken lives. In the end, the human cost of this story extended far beyond the courtroom or execution chamber. It spanned families, communities, and generations. 1 police officer dead, 2 adults executed, a child forever scarred, and a state left to reckon with the legacy of its most notorious electric chair. More than 2 decades later, when people speak of Lynda Lyon Block, they often do so with mixed tones: fascination, revulsion, pity. She remains an enigma, a woman who fought the law not out of impulse, but out of deep-seated belief. To some, she was a fanatic; to others, a lost soul who mistook rebellion for righteousness. And above the execution chamber at Holman, Yellow Mama still waits, silent, untouched, gathering dust. A reminder of the night its currents claimed the first woman in Alabama in 45 years, and the last to die by its hand. Her story may have ended in fire and silence, but its echoes remain, warning of how conviction without compassion can destroy not only lives, but entire legacies. Lynda Lyon Block's story is a web of contradictions, a woman who once fought to protect animals and uphold compassion, later turning into a killer who rejected the very idea of human authority. Her life began with purpose, drifted into rebellion, and ended in the cold precision of an electric current. It's a transformation that forces us to question how idealism, when twisted by anger and fear, can become something dark and destructive. She saw herself as a protector of the weak, of her son, of freedom itself. Yet, in that Walmart parking lot, protection gave way to paranoia. Her defiance, once aimed at injustice, evolved into defiance against any form of control, even when that control was lawful. What began as a belief in liberty became a prison of ideology, where every rule was an enemy and every authority a threat. But was she purely evil, or tragically lost? That's the haunting question at the heart of her story. Her intelligence, charm, and determination were undeniable, so was her descent into extremism. It's possible to see glimpses of a person who could have done great good, had she not been consumed by her conviction that the system was her enemy. Did ideology blind her to humanity? Could anything, love, therapy, understanding, have pulled her back from that edge? Or was she already too far gone, too deep in her own world to see the damage she was causing? And what about the system itself? How does justice deal with those who reject justice entirely? When someone refuses lawyers, refuses the court's legitimacy, and even refuses to plead for life, is the system still capable of delivering fairness? Or does it become an unyielding machine, meeting defiance with death? Her case also raises questions about the human heart. Lynda was not a monster born overnight. She was a woman shaped by loss, her father's death, a broken marriage, years of distrust, and an ideology that promised control in a world that had taken it away. In trying to live free, she destroyed her own freedom and others' lives along with it. And then there's the ripple effect. The son left without a mother, the officer's family left without a father, 2 lives extinguished by the same act of defiance. When belief turns into war, everyone loses. So what do you think? Was Lynda Lyon Block a misguided idealist, a cold-blooded killer, or both? At each turning point, her first arrest, her standoff with police, her decision to reject the court, what would you have done differently if you were in her place? Tell me your thoughts below. And if you found this story compelling, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Your voice matters, and every comment helps us uncover the truth behind the people and stories that challenge what justice really means.